I'd say I watched just a few movies this year. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. Just like I've done the last few Januaries, today I'm going to be doing a bit of a cinematic recap by going over my 2023 Letterboxd Year in Review. By watching my reviews, you guys only get a very limited sampling of all the movies I watch each year, so I wanted to share a slightly more comprehensive look at my year in film. You guys seem to enjoy the last few years of these videos, and I always love looking at stats like this, so I wanted to do another updated version for this year. I know many of you already have Letterboxd, or are at least aware of it, but for those of you who aren't, Letterboxd is a website that allows you to keep track of the movies that you watch. There are a ton of features, like the ability to write and review films, organize movies in lists or with tags, follow your friends' movie activity, and interact with the broader film community. And then there's just lots of movie information to dig your teeth into. Different ways to sort and filter and organize the movies you've seen, the ones you haven't seen, the ones you want to see. The vast majority of these features are available with a free account, but the year in review I'm going to be going through in this video is a pro feature, so it does cost about $20 to unlock.
Alright, so let's dive into these stats. At the top of the page, we get an overview of sorts for the year. So you can see here that I watched 1,000 movies last year. That 1,000 obviously isn't restricted to just movies released in 2023, so it includes literally everything I watched last year, including rewatches. That's a 209 movie increase over 2022's 709 movies, and by far the most movies I've watched in a single year since I joined Letterboxd back in 2014. Beating my previous record set in 2022. Moving on, I wrote 132 reviews and created 32 new lists. The next two numbers here reflect my social activity on the site, which is admittedly limited compared to other social media. So I liked 9 things during the year: films, lists, other people's reviews, and I left 14 comments on reviews or lists. The last number here is the number of hours I spent watching movies last year. This is an underestimated approximation, since it doesn't take into account extended cuts or the countless Blu-ray special features I watch, but 1,627 hours comes out to about 67.8 days of movie watching. So I literally spent about 18.5% of my time last year actively watching movies. Moving down the stats page, we hit the films by week section. This histogram gives an interesting temporal overview of the year, including any spikes and dips in the number of movies I watched in a given week. A couple sections of note. Mid to late January sees a bit of a spike because that was when I attended Sundance Film Festival. Week 7 also saw a bit of a spike because that was the week I watched all of the Oscar-nominated short films. September also sees a pretty good spike because that was during my coverage of the Toronto International Film Festival. And then I've got a decent spike at the end of the year because that was when I realized how close I was to 1,000 movies for the year. I highly doubt I'll ever be able to watch that many movies again in a single year, so with the week off from work, I buckled down and watched the final 41 movies I needed, ending the year with my most prolific week. Like I mentioned before, I watch at least one movie per day, so the lowest week on the graph actually has 8 films, not counting the goofy little week 1 here, which was literally just January 1st. Next, we get a nice monthly and weekly average to really showcase my insanity, and then another histogram breaking down all of my movies watched by day of the week. The spike on Thursdays makes sense, since that's when I usually go to see new releases, though I don't have much of an explanation for Sundays, other than that it's the weekend. Moving along, we've got the milestones section. So the first film I watched on January 1st was a first-time watch of Letter Never Sent, a Criterion release I got for Christmas in 2021. My last film of the year, on December 31st, was a rewatch of Trading Places, a fairly fitting New Year's Eve movie. In the middle here, we've got some highlights of my movie milestones for the year, giving you a sense of my pace. The next section here is for my most watched movies during the year. I don't usually obsessively rewatch films throughout the year, so you can see that my max rewatches were 3 times. Anytime I catch Miss Congeniality on TV, I always stop and watch. And then these other two, Past Lives and Polite Society, were films I watched at Sundance, caught again in theaters later on with a friend of mine, and then rewatched for a third time on Blu ray. Next, we've got genres, countries, and languages. As usual, US dramas in English were by far the leader here. Lots of movies are tagged as dramas, so it kind of gets an unfair advantage, but comedies, thrillers, and adventure films weren't that far behind. In terms of countries, the UK was second on the list, which is always the case for me, with some of my other typical countries rounding out the top 10. As for language, I didn't have much variation from my usual Spanish and French runners up, but Russian and Norwegian made it into the top 10 for the first time. This genres, countries, and languages section does feature the toggle for highest rated this year, so we can briefly take a look at that. For genre, it looks like crime films were my top rated, with sci-fi and then TV movies rounding out the top three. TV movies were primarily thanks to me rewatching quite a few of the Disney Channel original movies I have on DVD. For countries, we're looking at Spain being my highest rated, followed by Ireland and Australia in the top three. And for language, Korean is actually my top rated this year, followed by Japanese and then French. Next up, we've got the themes and nano genres section, which is a patron-only feature. The theme side basically gives you an overall snapshot of common themes or topics in the movies you watched that year. So this one, intriguing and suspenseful murder mysteries, is full of whodunits. Then adorable animals and heartwarming families was a mix of mostly Disney and Pixar family films. You get the idea. The nano genre side highlights specific subgenres and kind of genre adjectives. So just glancing through some of these top nano genres, it seems like I watched a lot of silly and cool action films packed with stunts and jokes. Briefly switching over to my highest rated within themes and nano genres, we can see how things shift a little bit. Moving on, we reach what Letterboxd calls the breakdown section. So this begins with a series of pie charts, the first of which showing the number of 2023 releases versus older films. I'm still working on some 2023 catch-up, so this number would already be different if it included films watched this year, but last year, only about 17% of the movies I watched were new releases, with 83% being films from 2022 or earlier. The second chart shows my number of first-time watches versus rewatches, and includes movies released in any year. At just under 64%, first-time watches reigned supreme this year, with only about a third of my movies being rewatches. Again, almost identical to my numbers from previous years. And the third pie chart here looks at my reviewing percentages. This chart more closely mirrors the first one, and you can see that I reviewed about 13% of the films I watched this year. So the remaining 87% were either just watched for fun, or if they were a rewatch, I had likely previously reviewed them during the year I first logged them on Letterboxd. The bottom half of the breakdown section has two more interesting pieces of information. The first is a histogram showing my rating spread for the year. As usual, 3 stars, or pause, was my most frequently given rating, with 330 different films this year. That said, things were skewed towards the positive side this year, with more than 26% of films getting 3.5 paws. At the extremes, I gave 2 movies a half paw rating, Invasion of the Pod People and Date Movie. Sadly, both were actually rewatches for me, though the first time since I joined Letterboxd. On the other end of the rating spectrum, just like last year, all of my 5-paw ratings were given to rewatches of old favorites. To find my highest rated first-time watches this year, you'd have to go to 4.5 paws to find Past Lives, John Wick Chapter 4, Woman of the Hour, and The Holdovers. The third segment of the breakdown section highlights my watch list, which is a feature on the site that lets you keep track of movies you're interested in watching. So you could see I watched 131 movies from my watch list, which is pretty good. But I did add 221 more movies to the list throughout the year, so basically, I'm never going to catch up. Next up is the stars section, which allows you to toggle between most watched and highest rated. Highest rated can be fun, but it's very easily skewed when you've only seen 2 movies. So I never put much stock in it, and instead find the most watched much more interesting. because it really tells the story of your year and especially of any franchises you might have watched. This section is usually dictated by my Blu ray box sets, but I actually caught up on watching all of my Blu rays this past year, so things were a bit different. Number one for the year with 15 films was James Stewart. I'm a fan of his and always watch It's a Wonderful Life each Christmas, but I also filled things in with a number of Hitchcock watches and quite a few of his older films airing on TCM. That's also how people like Humphrey Bogart, Vincent Price, and Spencer Tracy made it onto the list as well. But then we've got a bunch of names on here that you probably don't recognize, and they're all thanks to one franchise I rewatched this year: The Land Before Time. Believe it or not, there are actually 14 of these dinosaur movies now. So that's how people like Jeff Bennett, Rob Paulson, Kenneth Mars, John Ingle, Tress MacNeille, Andy McAfee, and more made it into my top stars of the year. Moving on, we've got the directors section, which functions just like the stars section. Once again, highest rated can be fun to look at, but it's way too easily skewed, so I always stick with most watched. I rewatched an awful lot of Hitchcock at the beginning of the year, so he takes the top spot with 18 films. The Land Before Time strikes again, pushing Charles Grosvenor into a three-way tie for second, along with Steven Spielberg and Guy Maddin, the latter of which was helped out by a number of shorts being included on his Criterion release. Shorts also helped push Wes Anderson up this year as well. Bud Greenspan is probably a director few of you have heard of, understandably, but he directed a number of Olympic films, and I finished up that Criterion box set last January. It's a chaotic director's list this year for sure. Even Rankin and Bass made it into my top 10. Next is the Cruise and Studios section. Again, there's a toggle for highest rated and most watched, and by now you know which one I find more useful. I'm not going to spend too much time on this section this year, but if you're interested, feel free to peruse my stats page or pause this video for a closer look. I'll give you a hint. There's a lot of Land Before Time influence here too. Moving on, we've got the highs and lows section. So of the films I watched in 2023, The Human Condition Part 3 has the highest average Letterboxd rating at 4.5 stars, while Date Movie has the lowest at 1.4 stars. Certainly can't argue with that one. Barbie was the most popular of my watched films on the platform, whereas the most obscure movie that I watched doesn't even have a poster on the website. But if you're interested, it was a 2023 short film called The Double Walker that I watched at the Maine International Film Festival. I am one of only 2 people to have logged the short on Letterboxd, and in fact, I was actually the first person to do so. The next 2 sections are patron-only stats, and show the films that I rated higher and lower than average. On the higher side, we've got a number of Disney Channel original movies and other 90s and early 2000s films that I've got a lot of nostalgia for. On the low side, we've got the abomination that was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, as well as some underwhelming Shakespeare and musicals. The next section just shows a visual representation of all the films I watched in 2023, in reverse chronological order. So kind of just a wall of posters, which you could expand if you were interested. Finally, the last section is the world map, which shows the country of production for all of the movies I watched in 2023. As we saw in the earlier section of the stats page, the US solidly holds the number 1 spot for me. But even though the numbers may be lower for the other countries, at least my movies were relatively diverse this year. As usual, African cinema always tends to be a bit of a blind spot for me each year, but I did manage to finally watch a Nigerian film this year, and also saw my first Peruvian and Guatemalan movies.
Alright, so there you have it, my 2023 Letterboxd Year in Review. I put a link to the stats page in the description below, so be sure to check it out if you want to dive deeper into any of these sections. And of course, don't forget to give me a follow while you're over there, so you can keep tabs on my movie watching throughout the year. So, do you have a Letterboxd account? What does your 2023 Year in Review look like? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. YouTube has a tendency to automatically delete or hide comments with links, so you're better off just including your Letterboxd handle rather than trying to link directly to your profile. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this year in review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this, as well as movie reviews. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.